Hey y'all, I am Todd. As you can tell, I don't always have pictures of myself in presentations. I'm not usually this narcissistic, but this was from a YouTube video. If you like what you see here, I have a YouTube channel where I'm actually in the midst right now of doing a Svelte series. Just recently posted this getting started, just get you kind of up and running, and then some of the stuff we're going to cover here will be in future videos, and then there's a lot more that should be in future videos. I also tweet sometimes at Mark on Twitter, and I try to avoid the latest JavaScript Twitter drama. I have some production values in this one. I don't know if we'll get audio on this. Are we going to get audio? Yeah, hey.
I think it's coming.
Probably no one can hear anything. Is that
You don't get sued or something.
Probably coming out of the
projector? Anyway, it makes me think of that film I Love You Man when he's telling his fiancée about Rush, and then he plays it on the computer, and it's so underwhelming because it's coming out of computer speakers. So this is extremely melodramatic. And obviously I'm being a bit hyperbolic in this. Mouse. But we have had a couple of years of there was jQuery, which was pretty awesome, especially for the time, and then we had Moo tools, and then we had Knockout and Backbone and some of those, and then Angular, and then kind of React and Vue sort of took over. I will not say nice things about Angular in this talk. Aurelia, yeah, go Aurelia. So I'm talking about Svelte. Svelte is kind of the new kid on the block. Find my thing here. So what is Svelte? Svelte was, it's not working at all. Svelte was, the history of anything in programming is we always hear about something and think it's so new, and then we find out it's been used for at least a little bit. So Svelte was created actually in 2016 by a guy named Rich Harris, who is, Mark Leave? Oh, there's Mark. A chap or a lad or a bloke, whichever one we're going with. I say that because he is English, Mark. He's a fellow Englishman. He doesn't sound like he's from Mark's neck of the woods. Doesn't sound like he's from your area, Mark. He sounds like he's more, his dialect is more classic RP English. So he's probably from London, but not Cockney. He is a graphics editor for the New York Times. And describes himself as a JavaScript journalist, which I think is probably one of the coolest titles you can have in programming. And so a lot of that influences Svelte and influences some of the approach that they took. Think about if you've gone to the Times. I used to work at the Washington Post. At the Post, we sometimes had some really cool data viz, like around elections. Stuff like data viz, which is going to be pretty render intensive and kind of graphics intensive. A lot of those things influenced Svelte. And Svelte was born out of a previous framework called reactive, reactive, which was kind of a niche framework. And so a lot of the things that Rich learned from reactive and Angular and React very much influenced Svelte. So Svelte asks a very specific and particular question, which is, what if instead of the typical JavaScript framework, which we write a bunch of components in code in our app for, and then run the framework in the browser, and then the framework runs our app? What if instead the framework was a compiler, and we write all our components in our app and everything, and the framework reads the app and then outputs it at build time and optimizes all the JavaScript. And then when the user runs it, all they're running is some optimized HTML and CSS and JavaScript. That philosophy underpins all of the decisions that have been made with Svelte. And if you think about it, that makes sense, right? If I'm at the New York Times and I'm doing these heavy data viz things, I don't want all the heavy lifting to happen in the browser. I want it to happen before it all loads into the browser, so that the user has the best sort of user experience. So how do we get started with Svelte? Rich also wrote a package called deacon, and recently I was on their Discord, and someone was asking about this. There is no create Svelte app, but this package deacon basically goes out to a Git repo, pulls down the latest commit, and kind of clones it locally. And so dgit and cloning the template repo is sort of the create Svelte app, create reactive Svelte. It's your create Svelte app. And under here, I want to point out that they don't really buy into the CRA philosophy. Actually, Joe talked about this last month when he did his kind of state of the React ecosystem, where create React app is great until you kind of need to do anything more robust, then you eject or do your own thing. So that being said, let's finally get to some code. I'm gonna have to. I don't know if I can blow that up. You're just gonna have to take my word on this. So we're gonna type npx dgit. I hope everybody is familiar with npx. It's this awesome tool that Kat at npm created, so we don't have to do global installs for things we just use every once in a while. So dgit svelte.js /template, and then whatever your, sorry, this is so small, and then whatever your project is going to be. So I'm just going to call this throwaway project, and it's going to run very, very quickly. So really quickly clone that repo, and then if we go, sorry, and then we launch VS Code, Google VS Code. And so this is the sort of beginnings of a Svelte app. We have this rollup config. Rollup is also a Rich Harris project. It is a module bundler. So if you use Webpack, it's very similar to Webpack. It's, there's Webpack and then there's everybody else, but of the everybody else, there's probably Rollup and Parcel. You can use Webpack if you really want to. You're not locked into Rollup. And there's a project I'll talk about, hopefully if I have time, a little later, called Sapper. And Sapper actually explicitly gives you the option to use Webpack and Rollup. Just like with Webpack, you've got some plugins, and then you use those plugins for very specific things that your app's going to do, and you've got an input where your bundler should look for the entry point of the app, and then it outputs your JavaScript bundle and with some options. This has source maps enabled and stuff like that. That's helpful. They give you some npm scripts in the package.json, most notably this dev, most notably build and dev. I'm just going to be running dev in the demos. And the thing to notice is it runs this auto build script, which runs rollup with a -c and a -w flag. -c means I have a config file. I'm not giving you config options in the CLI. And -w means we're going to run it in watch mode. We also get a few things that we need out of the box. We get a sort of basic index.html. This is boilerplate standard stuff for web apps these days, where we look for that bundle.js. It's not there, obviously, because I haven't built yet. And then some style sheets and things. So we've got a global CSS. And then let's get to the sort of good stuff here. So we have a main.js, which is the entry point of the app. This is very similar to something like Vue. I may mention Vue a few times here, but I've done very little Vue. And somewhat similar to what you see in a React app. This is very standard stuff, except maybe Vue has this, I don't know. But there's a sort of top level props, which maybe you would, if you're doing like an auth 0 or something and you've got a user object and maybe at your very top level you want to inject it there. There is a global state management library within Svelte, so maybe you want to do that there. But anyway, long story short, there's this props object, And then this is a Svelte component. So again, if you're used to something like Vue, this should look very, very similar. I think the main difference, at least with this most bare bones component, is that there is no template tag, which I believe Vue uses. There's also, notice that there's like a single bracket. So at one point, I think at one point Svelte, so I should also mention this is Svelte 3. Earlier versions of Svelte, I'll only bring up in terms of how they affect Svelte 3. There was a blog post they had that basically React showed that you don't need the double brackets that like Angular has. And Steve, did you know Vue has double brackets? Or
Oh, I keep forgetting. It's one or two.
I know you,
My browser does the right thing. I mean, my editor does the right thing.
And I know you do a lot of Angular, so probably nodes in your brain. One other thing to notice, in this script tag, there's an export, which is a little weird. And with that, why don't we start to dig in a little bit more. So I'm going to close this and get rid of it because I have another project. And let's start to talk about some of the basic syntax. Okay, right. So let's talk about this. So I said at the top, at least at the introduction of the entry point, that there is this prop thing, and anytime you have variables or functions or anything in your script tag, it is accessible in your markup area. So that's why we can get this name. And I also, so let me run this. Okay, didn't blow up. So that's good. So, super exciting app, just says hello Todd. But why does it say hello Todd? And the reason is, in the entry point, I specified in this props object that the name would be Todd. But here's the reason that there's an export. If I save and go back, just close that. Now it says hello Marky, because props in Svelte work a little differently. So essentially, what I'm doing here is kind of a default, like a default parameter. So.
I got lost in what you just did when you showed hello Todd.
Yeah.
And then you showed this, and it said hello Marky. It seemed like you showed the same file. I don't see Todd in this file.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Good question, Joe. So, and I probably should slow down. I'm so afraid of running out of time. So there's this prop at the top level that has a name, and that name is Todd. And if you notice in the app.svelte, there's a name variable, and I was only able to get the prop in. Basically, you can only get the prop into the component if you export the variable. Think of it like a class in object-oriented programming, where all of this state is, and everything in here is like internal or private, and it only becomes publicly accessible by an export, which kind of makes sense. By the way, this, at least in all of my playing with Svelte, that top level prop, that's the only time you do a prop like that. Every other component, I'll show you a better example. Any other?
Seems kind of counterintuitive that if you don't export it, it shows mark, and if you export it, it doesn't show mark.
That if I don't export it?
When you took export out, it showed Todd, right? And
No. When
I'm
the
sorry.
export's there, it shows my name.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, and the other thing
That's what you're
is,
expected to do.
Okay, good.
yeah, and the other thing is, like, if I wipe away that prop, then it'll just show Marky, right? Think of it this way. This is the state of this component with this name variable. It only gets a prop if it gets a valid prop, but if it gets a prop, the prop wins. Essentially, we'll see. I'll show you
Okay.
more of that.
Okay.
So here is, just make sure I'm up to date. Right. Okay, this is a better example. I mean, the first one was meant to be very simple. So now we have. Don't disregard the Peloton thing. So now we've got a button that when I click it, it just increments, and then another button that resets. And the code for that is super simple. I have a counter in this, in my app.svelte, and in the, and then there's a button. So this is that orange button. And I just have an inline function that increments it. And so one of the key takeaways here is reactivity. So the reactivity in Svelte is based on reassignment. So whereas in something like React, we do a this.setState, and it triggers a re-render, this is only re-rendering the little bit that needs to be re-rendered. And there's a great talk Rich Harris did, Steve and I were talking about just a minute ago, about reactivity. And the example he used was a spreadsheet. So if you think about, you have a spreadsheet and you have a formula in one, and the formula is looking at another cell. And it only updates your formula cell if you change something in one of them, right? It doesn't re-render the whole spreadsheet, and it doesn't go in and check the whole spreadsheet to see what changes. It only goes in and changes the little piece of the spreadsheet that changes. And this is kind of compared to something like the virtual DOM in React. Like the virtual DOM in React, where it'll go, Mark, now that you're learning React, there's the reconciliation, right? So we've got a virtual DOM, we've got the real DOM, it kind of compares the two. But is that fast enough for a lot of applications? Yes, but is it really, really fast? Not really, because you've got all the extra overhead of the virtual DOM. And then also consider that in the sort of milieu of Rich at the New York Times doing this data visualization stuff. So this is reacting simply because this counter is being reassigned, right? We're saying counter equals counter plus one, and we're reassigning the counter. Now, to talk about props, so I've got this reset button, which it's completely unremarkable. I'm exporting a variable, and that variable is going to be a prop. So if we look at the app.svelte, notice I'm passing in this reset counter, so it's just a really simple function expression that sets the counter to 0. And when I click it, it reacts instantly. And I'm passing that down as a prop to this reset button component. And the only, to get to your question, the only way I can do that is because this reset handler is only publicly accessible because I've exported it. Right? That's how the prop can get into the component. And so one other thing before I move on, hopefully that should be clear. There are going to be more examples that'll drill that in. One other very quick thing I want to touch on is that Svelte is written with CSS as a kind of first-class citizen, and Rich has stated that you can use a CSS and JS library, but really you don't need to. Svelte was written in the sense that you shouldn't need to bring in another library. CSS is complete first-class citizen. And one way this is impacted is notice that I'm just applying CSS to a button element, and in like a global CSS, right? And all that is like adding some border radius, and it makes the button orange and the font white. But notice that my basically child component is not getting that CSS applied to it. And that's because the CSS is component specific. So, and part of the reason for that is CSS our needs for CSS have become really robust over the years, right? Especially with single page applications. And there are certain naming strategies we've come up with to sort of deal with those problems. I'm a huge fan of BEM. I like anything that helps me really structure things. But the problem is when you use BEM, sometimes in your markup, you end up with like, a class and then another class and then a class that's your modifier. And so you end up with like this really unwieldy CSS. But what if everything is component specific and I'm only even applying it to my p tag or my main or whatever? So that's very important to keep in mind about Svelte and CSS. And I'll even show you when it built the CSS in this public. So it built the bundle when I did a run dev, just remember rollups running. When we look at the bundle.css, what it does, see this is our button that it applied it to, and it just says button.svelte, and then it adds a hash. And then if we inspected it, you would see that class applied to the button.
Can you opt into Cascade?
Yes, yeah, very good question, Ernesto. So you can do a global CSS, and if you look in the public, one of the things they gave us out of the box is this global.css.
Gotcha.
So you can override that if you have stuff that you don't have to keep putting in the same button styling, right? That was really annoying. Yeah, and that's a great point. And I want to say this because I'll probably run out of time pretty quickly.
Dude, when do you think you're going to be?
In like 5 or 10 minutes.
You've got 20 minutes.
But I'm also going to need time for questions.
You're making an enormous assumption there.
Okay. that is also.
I actually have a lot of questions.
Okay, you've got 3 minutes.
You're fine.
Dude,
You're fine, Todd.
take your time.
But there's a lot of things that I've found in Svelte that are kind of opt-in. And when I get to reactive declarations, that's going to be one thing that I'll harp on. There are things that I've grown really accustomed to, especially as a React front-end developer, that I just really like doing. And there are some very React-like things you can do. I'll show you, hopefully in my last example that I show you, you can do things like conditional classes and in the exact same way I would do it in a React component. So there's a very much the way they have looked at it and think about it. Okay, we've got a compiler. So even think about something like Preact, right? Preact had a moment maybe a year or two ago, and Preact's claim to fame is, hey, we're React, but we're only 3 KB of a library, and that's great because it's small. But compare that to something like Svelte, you don't have the constraint of the library. You don't even have that 3 KB. But the bigger issue is how many features are you going to get into a 3 KB library? Not many, right? That's why it's H as a function call and like very bare bones syntax. With Svelte, they're taking a different approach, which is, hey, we're a compiler. When you compile it, when you build it, and it kind of outputs all the optimized stuff, it's going to tree shake it. You're only going to get the stuff you really need. You're not going to get the whole library. So back in the day when I did Angular 1, you'd have this whole big library that would load in. And that was great. I mean, it was okay for the time because you got a lot of features, but you got all that bloat with it. So, okay, I think we're going to talk about reactives because those are interesting. And I talked about, okay, so let's do that now. So one of the things they have, I totally stole that idea of switching branches from Joe.
That's a genius idea.
It was a brilliant idea. Okay, so let me run this.
I'm certain I stole that from somewhere else.
As a music teacher once told me, the good ones borrow, the great ones steal. And I'm sure he stole that from someone
No,
else.
I've never heard that before.
So, oops. Okay, so now we've got another counter. Again, these are very trivial examples. So we've got another counter, and then every time I click the counter, it doubles, right? Ooh, big exciting demo. But the way it's doing it is kind of interesting. And so we've got a counter, and we've got a handle click function, and all that's doing is when we call an onClick, and by the way, this is the syntax for an event. this was one of the things as I was looking at, I was like, ooh, I don't know, like custom HTML syntax, it kind of gives me the Angular 1 heebie-jeebie. But I quickly found, as I have in many things in Svelte, I found it very quick to grok in ways that I didn't with Svelte or Angular 2 Plus or any of those. And it's pretty intuitive, right? It's on mouse over or on whatever. It's the same thing. You just add the colon and you're done. So our click handler takes this handle click function, but this has what's called a reactive statement. Or a reactive, actually this is a reactive declaration. And this looks very strange, but this is actually valid JavaScript.
Is that a label?
Wow. Or did you see my Twitter post?
No, it's like go-to.
Nice. So this is something in the language. It's called a labeled statement. And let me show you. And they kind of hijacked it a little bit to do something that they wanted it to do. But if I do $Todd equals Todd,
You can zoom that in.
can I?
Yeah.
Control plus plus.
Shift.
Oh, there we go.
Control
Nice.
plus.
Okay, that's probably better. Right. So basically, I declared that variable with the labeled statement, and now if I console log it. It logs it out. So something, you know, a completely neat JavaScript. It's got everything. You just don't know it does. Right? And so what happens is we've got this declaration. So basically, it's watching that every time count gets changed, we're going to have this doubled variable, and it's going to be count times 2. Now, where it gets really interesting is you can have a reactive statement. And so this reactive statement says, okay, we're watching for count, and now every time count goes above 10, I'm going to throw an alert and then reassign it so it doesn't keep incrementing. And that is called a reactive declaration or a reactive statement. I have a bit of a reaction to this, though. And that is that just because something is there doesn't mean you should use it, and that the sort of general principles of, you know, good programming still apply. Which is all of those things I could do with totally the most basic way of doing it, right? Which is to say, I could have a function here for check for max. Another brace, right? And then on here, I could just, if you look at the code that gets output, is basically what they're doing. There's some ifs. It's
Everything is from params after check for max.
Thank you. There we go. And the reason I somewhat reject that is that's great for something really trivial, but if I've got those littered throughout, they don't. You know, part of the point of a function is not just to execute something; it's to tell the reader what's happening. And there's nothing like a well-labeled function. You know, if I have to read the implementation details of every function, I'm probably going to quit. I'm just going to leave the company and be like, these people don't know what they're doing. So that is a reactive declaration or reactive statement. Let's go to, this is probably my favorite one. So this is, oh, and also this is kind of cool. It'll give you accessibility warnings, so that's sort of in there by default. I mean, I think even Create React App has that now. But if you have some, like I have an image tag specifically in there that doesn't have an alt attribute, it gives me a warning at build time. So let's
Is that
load.
something you had to opt into?
What's that?
Is that something you had to opt into?
No, that was just
That's
out of the
just
box.
out of the box.
Yeah. So it's really nice. Okay. Mark, this is a little bit of me taking the piss out of Mark. So,
Oh, fuck off.
so we've got, this is also very simple, right? We've got, this is really bad. I actually came up with this example before it came up. So there's this guy, Rafa Benitez. If you don't follow football, what's really football, what we call in America soccer. Although soccer, actually, the term comes from England. Rafa Benitez is the famous manager of Newcastle United, well, of Real Madrid and Liverpool and others. And he just recently left Newcastle. So this would be, I'm Rafa Benitez, and I'm going in, and I've got to figure out what choice I want to make. So my first choice is to stay at Newcastle, and of course, why would you stay at Newcastle? Maybe my third choice, he's Spanish, right? Maybe I'll retire to a beach in Spain. That would be a really good idea because Spain is gorgeous. And Mark, this one's especially for you. I could just leave Newcastle. And that's very true.
That is so true.
Because Mike actually is a tosser.
Yes.
And that's a totally niche joke that only is pretty much for apparently Ernesto, me, and Mark. Sorry, everybody else who doesn't care about soccer.
I think British swear
So-
words are adorable.
That's right. Todd
I
is
know.
cute, is
That's
what
like-
everybody is thinking.
It's like compared to a Joe Matalone swear, that's just like that's like in the negatives,
It's not like
right?
I invented this thing swears I
You're just a progenitor of enthusiast. And so, okay, so again, we've got this click handler. I guess one of the things to build on, previously, this is something very similar to what we do in React. So on change, on the select, we just take a look at the event. I'm destructuring the value out of the event target, choosing that. But that's not really the interesting thing. The interesting thing, well, there's two. One is, so I've got this options object, and I'm kind of gathering all of my props so I can send them into the component. So just like in a React component, I don't know about you, you can spread syntax your props into your component. If we look at the child component, we can do so because we've exported all three of those props. So we get those. And then this is the sort of interesting piece. So that's options, if you remember, was an array. So we get this options array. Those are the ones in the select. Mark, how am I doing on time?
Good.
Okay.
I don't know. If you tell me you have an hour left, not good.
Well, I do, but we're not going to get
It's
through
been
it.
like 8 minutes since you last freaked out.
That last
You got 10 minutes, Tom.
So we've got, let me even bring this up a little bit. So we've got this each block, and this is some kind of syntactic sugar they give us. Think of this as no different than a map in React. So you'd have your curly braces, you'd have a map, you map over the array. Also of interest is that if I grab a second param, it's the index, and as you note, I'm taking the index and just adding one to it just so I don't have a 0 as one of my values. And it's essentially like doing a map without needing to do a map. And this was one of the other things I saw that I was like, I don't know, I remember those, Joe, I know you did Angular 1. I remember those Angular, like, each blocks, and I don't know. But it, again, was something that just was so easy to grok that it was something I kind of liked. The other thing we can do is there are if blocks. So we could say if plus 1 mod 2 equals 0. So we just want to check the odds and evens. Then return this, and then we can add an else block.
I was really into this, Todd, until this part. This is like 18 steps backwards this time.
I thought so too, Joe.
Yes, we did
But
this with handlebars and mustache and underscore.
It was good enough then, it's good enough.
Yeah.
It was not good then.
Get off my lawn, old man.
right, so we can add
Is it really colon else? Wow.
It is actually.
Don't pressure it.
I know. Come on, guys.
Out of time.
Oh, shit.
This was honestly the thing. It's funny you say that, Joe, because this was the thing I was like, I know Joe's going to hate this.
I leaned over to Mark a second ago. I was like, Todd has drunk the Kool-Aid. Like, at first I was, and now I love it.
All right, everybody, it's time to go home.
Well, I wouldn't say I love it, but I very much like the each blocks. The if blocks, I'm not sure. There's also an await block, which
It's
you
a
probably
go-to
will also
block.
hate. There is not not yet.
These are the only. But in reality, these are kind of like the only conditionals you need in a template. I mean that's the thing. Right?
Yeah.
You're looping and you're.
Actually,
you
we
have
don't need
conditionals.
if statements. We've learned that.
So one of the things, so here's the thing I would say in response to that is if you work with certain kinds of programmers, you get tired of I would much rather have an if and done in this way. It's much more explicit than a bunch of ternaries and a frickin' single
I totally
condition.
agree.
I know you
That's
disagree.
a shortfall. No, I agree. That's a
Oh,
shortfall of JSX.
Oh, really?
I was joking about we don't need to,
Sure.
but
I know. I
this is not the answer.
give it time. Maybe it'll work on you. So so I know now I'm running out of time.
You're good, man.
Let's go to master, and then we'll do a much more robust example. Oh, of course. Isn't that the way it always goes?
Something wrong with your HTML job? What is that called? That language? HTML script.
See, he tried to learn from the Git master and he failed.
Oh no, I think he must have.
Oh, I know what it is.
It's a
Sorry.
weird markup.
No, it's not them. Okay. Oh, of course.
Deep
Right,
resolve.
Jason.
Oh, couldn't resolve it. Can't find it. Okay, good. That's what I want to have. There we go. Doesn't build now. Okay. So now we've got a bit more robust, if not aesthetically pleasing app. And so this app, all it does is takes, it actually goes out to the eye. These are up to date. So if anybody needs to check their stock quotes, let me know. These are up to date. And then we can add it to this watch list. It lets me know when I added it. Other stuff. And so it loads a watch list. Because I'm going to run out of time, I think this is a good last example. So what's going on here? So again, and I would recommend maybe not putting all this stuff in your app.svelte. But again, I'm just applying styling to the elements themselves, not a class. I'm passing in some props. Pulling in the user.name. I even turned this into an object, so if you think about getting an object like from Auth0 or something like that. And I've got a lookup form. So this lookup form is doing an if block, which apparently is a no-go for some people here. And it's checking to see if we have stock data, and if we don't, we reload it. If we don't, it just does this. And the reason I'm doing that is because if I just put in a bunch of nonsense, I don't want to error. So we check that, and then we output it. And then this has, I brought up the the conditional formatting. So I have, if you notice, some of these are in red if they're down, and some of them are in green if they're up. And I'm just doing conditional formatting, just like exactly like I would in React. Right. So same there. This is interesting. This is another potential polarizer. So typically in this add to watch list function, and you could, right, I could opt in for this. This add to watch list function would take an event. I don't remember where this is. It would take an event, right, and then we do event.prevent default. But one of the reasons why some of these things are in Svelte is because the team is saying, hey, we don't have to worry about size of the library. So we want to give you helpers for things that you're typically going to be doing, right? So a good example is in my input. Right, so this handles input, and it's just taking in whatever I'm typing into an input box, a text box, and you end up writing the exact same code over and over. Event, check for it, prevent it, whatever. So these are helpers that they give us. So instead of having to add that event.prevent default, they just give me, I can just throw it on the event here, and I get it out of the box. And I can prove it to you this way. So I just pull it off this. And that's because it's a form, right? So if I do this, and I just hit enter, well, now I'm proving a liar. You're just gonna have to trust me. It was actually better on the Mark 1 on the Rafa Benitez thing, because you could see it would clearly blip, and then the form would reload, and then you'd lose whatever was there. There is also, and then for that watch list, I'm just doing it each, and with the small amount of time I have left, you'll notice there's this $current user.stocks. What?
You have 15 minutes, including questions.
Okay, good.
That's the first time I have told you that.
Okay. So, good.
So how did it get those props? Because it looked like in your Svelte app or whatever, it didn't seem like it was passing the props to the watch list.
That. Which prompts?
So how is he get? So he's getting current user.stocks.
Yes. So
where is he getting that?
So I was
from?
going to get to that.
Okay,
So
sorry.
Svelte has a store in it that comes with it, and so let me show you. It's typically the convention and everything I've seen. I've got this writable. So there's writable if I know that I'm going to change it. There's readable, which is I'm just going to set it, but I want it read throughout the app. And I want it globally available. So to not skip a step here, I've been taking stuff and just passing it into components, right? But a long time ago, well, at least in the JavaScript world a long time ago, it was probably 2 years ago, we had we solved the problem with prop drilling. This is called prop drilling. When I have a prop and I have to drill it, I have to keep passing it down the component chain just to get it to where I need it. And Redux is the most famous fix for that. And then there's MobX and Immer and some of these other things. Svelte just comes with a very simple, store functionality out of the box. There are some caveats in that. Typically, what I would have to do is here. So typically, what I would have to do is something like this. Equals user, subscribe, and then I would pass in something. Value. And again, this is, remember that they're trying to add stuff that reduces boilerplate. don't know if I'd have time to get to these, but now that I do, let's do. Is that upsetting you, Mark? I just hear
The weirdest anxiety.
guffaws. Well, it's because when I ran this earlier, I was like always out of time. I just talked too much.
No, you're just eating up some time.
Yeah, you're actually reducing the questions time, so you remember everybody, he's being selfish right now.
He's answering my question.
All that Newcastle stuff.
Yep, it is the Newcastle stuff.
Technically not.
That's what I get for taking the mickey out of Mark.
That's what it's my ones.
Right, I wonder if it might not work right now. Anyway, oh yeah, it works. So there's all this rigmarole that you have to go around with subscribing to the store. And the reason I have this unsub is this subscribe function returns an unsubscribe function. And then if you don't, so this undestroy is like a component will unmount. Component will?
Lifecycle method.
It's a there's some lifecycle methods. So there's unmount, which is typically recommended to be used if you're going to be doing data fetching. My example is a little bit different because the data fetching is form related. But there's really only a few. Thankfully, there's not like when I first started learning reactive, it was like 7. There's unmount, undestroy, and maybe 1 or 2 others. But if I don't do this, it essentially could lead to a memory leak. So, but the Svelte team was like, well, why do we have people do this constantly when all we have to do is do $current user? And then that $, this was another thing that gave me the Angular 1 heebie-jeebies. Anytime I see a $sign, I'm like, oh, you know, I'm like, I think I might be out of here. And then I keep playing with it and I like it.
$.1 root scope.
Oh God! No! Yeah, right. Just nightmares. Just cold. Wake up in a cold sweat nightmares. But its use is very, very limited, and it's nice because anywhere in a component, if I pull something from the store that was exported, by the way, the reason I can access that current user is I'm just exporting it as a constant, right? And I just throw $1 in front of it, and it automatically subscribes. So I don't have to do all of that boilerplate in all my components. So those are like the two things under that philosophy, right? Are everything at build time and anything, because we can add features. Anytime there's something people are going to have to keep doing, let's give them a helper for it. A helper that, as we've talked about, you can opt in or out of. If you want to keep writing that stuff, or maybe have edge cases, you're not limited. Let me see. Okay, well that gives me some time. So I just talked about the store. There are so I got through a lot more than I expected to. There are some other things that you get out of the box in the library. There are transitions, there are animations. They have a context API if you want to start writing your own stuff for it, just like with React. And then there are some special elements that especially apply if you're doing server-side rendering. But if you're going to do server-side rendering, and if you're going to look at Svelte, you should really look at Sapper. And Sapper, there's a great, really excellent blog post by Rich Harris about this. And Sapper is the Next.js modeled server-side isomorphic framework that the Svelte team has created. And it's, when I say modeled on, like, this whole post is about, like, this is why we think Next is great and why we want something in Svelte that is basically Next. And it's called Sapper. Any military people here? Apparently Sapper is a military term, so if you look on the...
Engineers.
Right?
Combat engineers.
Combat engineers. And also it stands for Svelte App Maker. So it's kind of both, but that's why they say at some point, I think they changed it, because at one point it was military grade progressive web apps, I think they just changed that because people didn't like that. And Sapper is really cool. So I have some apps that I've been playing with, and I think I'm probably going to do them in Sapper. And there are some things like your routes. Your routes are just pages, just very much like Next.js. Next.js is this framework for reactive, I forgot to mention. There's also Svelte native, which is, actually, before I get to that, Sapper, I believe, is not in full release yet. So it's still, I believe it's on beta. And then Svelte native, which is being worked on, it's modeled on NativeScript Vue. And then there's another project called Svelte GL, which, as this says, is just an idea right now. But it makes sense, when you're doing a lot of data viz and heavy graphics stuff, it makes sense that someone who does that regularly would be interested in doing, taking their library and making a GL library for it. Questions?
So,
Joe.
Whoever's over there.
how does it keep track of all the elements in the list? Do you have keys like it does in React?
No.
So how does it know which one to modify in a list? And does it have to go through everything?
That is a good question. I don't know because it's all under the hood. So however they're doing it.
Because in React and
You
you
may
have
just have
keys.
right, exactly, yeah, and then I've gotten more than my fair share of those warnings that I didn't provide keys to my React components. So I know exactly what you're talking about. My guess is they're doing it on index, but there's no requirement for you to have to do it. Which is
So you have
another
to
reason why
modify
maybe
the
an
DOM
block
no
is a
matter
good
what you
thing. So, Joe?
I'm trying to make it fun.
Sure.
I was just curious, in the, I don't know if we're calling them components or whatever, the code you have where you like your script and then your HTML.
Right.
Why are all the exports let? Or all the ones that I saw, they were all
Yes. Yes. So that was another thing I struggled with because so many of us have been like, use const unless for whatever reason you have to use let, but don't use let, right? And that is because they are publicly available and technically modifiable. And if it's a constant and you try to reassign it, now you've got a problem because it's a constant. Constants are shallowly immutable. Right. I can. If it's an object, I can change its properties, but I can't. Right. And I think the part. It was definitely something I struggled with. I was like, oh man, I swore to never use lets. And I've been in code reviews and being like, why are we doing lets here? You could just like return something directly and use a const. I might have a better answer for you in my next presentation on Svelte in 5 months. I still, what's that?
sticking with it, huh?
We'll see. I might just play around with it. I'm still, I wore the React shirt just to be like, hey, don't kill the messenger. I'm still a React person. But we'll see what happens after I play with it. But that's exactly why, well, that's my understanding why. It's because these are getting props, right? So I'm declaring them at a certain time, but at a later point, I'm getting a value for it. And I believe if it was a constant, we could play. I could just change one of those to a const and see what happens. That didn't blow up. It's kind of a fun, let's change this. Yeah, it just totally blew up. And unexpected token.
How's the rest of the button pushes? If you're not getting a value.
Oh, yes. Yeah, because they have to be initialized.
Oh, so that kind of doesn't make sense then. I mean, because you need to pass in
Right.
a function in this case.
Right.
Because it's the only way that you could pass a prop to it. Is if it's
Well, earlier it was like let name equal marquee, and I was like, why does it need to be?
It doesn't look like a function.
Oh, right.
So
yeah,
that wasn't
even
a
just a
function,
simpler.
it wasn't.
right. Well, no, because the top level main was
so in this
passing.
instance, if he was actually reassigning it in the component logic or whatever, that I get. That seems like all of them were doing it. Like the original example where it's like Todd and the main
Right.
props, but Marky and the component props, I guess. You had left and actually.
Oh,
But that's
right.
okay.
That's-
So this is mostly, it seems like it's view oriented, it's a view
Yes.
kind of library with animations and all that. So what is the, being completely unaware of what the ecosystem is like for this and what's happening with this? You pointed
Yeah.
out like a cool like GL thing going on and some other bits, but like the forward validation, routing, things of that nature. Are we, are those available or?
I haven't looked at form validation. There is a router. They're still in the early stages of a router. There's something called Svelte routing.
Is that like
Which
an
looks-
official router or is that somebody else's?
I think they've sort of blessed it.
Okay.
I don't know if from what I've read, they recommend, there's more to that question. There's more to the answer. But from what I've read, they actually recommend that you use Sapper because Sapper has routing built in.
Oh.
But if you're just doing a pure Svelte app and you want to do routing, they've sort of blessed something called Svelte routing, which looks exactly like React Router. And the other thing is, I think, yeah, well, I won't go there because there's more to that. One thing that came up in my mind as we were talking, one other thing I like about the each block is you could also destructure in this. So we don't have to always do this. So we just destructure those values. So I'm doing.
So this templating, let's call it language, it's not JSX, but you can interpolate pure JavaScript.
Yes.
So could you technically do like a map here and output would it have to be strings? 'Cause I mean, obviously it's not pure JavaScript. It's you're like the blocks. I mean,
Right. So within the curlies, you can do any valid JavaScript. But I tried doing like check a value and then return a component, and that totally blew up.
okay.
So
Well,
I
you
think
probably
that
have to output it somehow as a string. I'm assuming. Do they have that? Do they have like what was it like percent symbols? Percent symbol.
I don't know. That's a
Some
good
version
question.
of something we got from ASP.
You know, I know there is like an SSR option where it basically does everything as a string. But yeah, I could
Like
do.
you're outputting company name as a string, right?
I could do this. Hopefully I didn't blow it up when I make that change. How did I get something, I think something blew up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's okay. It's part of that line thing earlier.
Yeah, I blew up something. But the answer is yes. So I could have put in any kind of valid JavaScript in those curlies and it would output it. So I think at one point when I was practicing this, I put like marquee and then I put plus, mathed up random, and then it just output some random number. So yeah, I guess I'm out of time. Finally.
Thank you very much, Todd.